Israel is making a small but bold statement. For the first time ever, Israel's central bank will add China's yuan to its currency reserves. Out of the country's current stockpile of $200 billion in foreign cash, 2% will be allocated to China's yuan. That's according to its central bank. Israel is dubbing the policy shift a philosophical change, where it would hold a basket of currencies. But the yuan's entry comes at the expense of the euro and dollar, which will see their proportions fall. And Israel isn't the only country looking to diversify its holdings. A recent survey by the IMF shows that at the end of last year, the US dollar's share of global currency reserves fell to its lowest level since 1995. And it's not just foreign exchange reserves where the US greenback is battling the yuan. Earlier this year, reports said Saudi Arabia was considering pricing some of its oil sales in China's currency. So, is the dollar's dominance waning? And can new challengers like China fill the void? And to answer that, joining me now from Tel Aviv is Dan Kataryvas. He is the Director General of the Foreign Trade and International Relations Division at the Manufacturers Association of Israel. And from Beijing, Einar Tangen. He is a political analyst and a senior fellow at the Taipei Institute. A warm welcome to you both, and thank you for joining me on Straight Talk. Einar, let me begin with you. Why do you think Israel is adopting China's yuan as part of its foreign currency reserves?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the kind of sanctions movement that's been going on abroad. I mean, if you start looking at the trade numbers, they're roughly equal to the U.S. China's just slightly behind at 7.7 billion. The U.S. is at 8 billion last year. But when you start looking at exports from Israel, China gets about 4 billion to the 13 billion that goes to the United States. But long term, there's been a lot of movements to boycott Israel. And China is not in that camp. And so therefore, they're balancing their economic needs in terms of the future.
So, Dan, what's your take on that? Is this a significant move? And what does this tell us about the Israel's broader economic policy and how it looks to the future?
Well, I would say that we see it as a purely, I would say, even technical adjustment. I won't connect it to the trade figure. But actually, as you know, the Bank of Israel is now reserve of over $213 billion, and they actually have to maximize the return, I would say, on those reserves, and they are changing the composition of the reserve according to their policy of whether they want to actually increase return on that amount of money. And the fact that dollar is definitely, I mean, we are trading with not only the Americans and not only in dollars, but also with Europe, etc. So from time to time, the central bank has adjusted what they called as a basket of currency that reflect indeed the foreign trade of Israel. But I wouldn't make it too much of political influences. This is purely technical, in the sense that we not only added the yuan as part of the reserve, but also the yen, because also we are developing our relation with Japan. So it's really a technical adjustment. I won't put politics too much into it.
Yes, Einar seems to disagree with you. But Einar, let's move on. And what kind of benefits will China see by investing in Israel?
Israel has a tremendous amount of high-tech goods. They're famous for their education. China treats countries based on their trade. Their internal matters are unto themselves. So Israel is not afraid that China is going to join this boycott movement. But, you know, Israel is very interested and has been in a lot of technical things, especially related to military. The U.S. has stepped in a number of times and said that they wouldn't allow it. There was a drone and a fighter that were, Beijing was eyeing. They were not allowed it. Earlier this year, Israel said that any trade dealings with China had to be authorized by the State Department, a very odd thing to say, given that you're an independent country. So, you know, they're stuck in this kind of crossroads. But, you know, at a time when, foreign direct investment was pouring out of China last month, I don't agree with this idea that they're making technical adjustments to improve their yield. If that was the case, they'd be looking at bond yields going up in the U.S. I do agree that they're looking long term at the power of the yuan and what that will mean to trade globally.
So, Dan, how do you think the U.S. would react to one of its closest allies' decision to adopt the UN as part of its reserves, given the economic rivalry between China and the U.S.?
Obviously, it's interesting because I think that with my colleague, the colleague here, I probably disagree on a lot of issues that he has not mentioned. Okay, I don't think that we are receiving orders from the U.S. When we authorize or we don't authorize Chinese activity in Israel. There was ups and downs in the Israeli relation with China for the last 30 years. I was myself the first Israeli economic attaché in Beijing about 30 years ago. And in the sense, it's true that on the military and defense, it's been for quite a while that Israel does not trade in defense with China. And this is certainly not the only country which avoid trading defense with China. On the other hand, we see a lot of Chinese companies which are participating in tenders for upgrading the Israeli infrastructure. I think the American, and I was just meeting an American diplomat yesterday that said very bluntly, look, we perfectly understand that a country like Israel, which is a small country, cannot ignore the fact that China is one of the leading economies in the world. We are not asking or demanding that you cease any relation with China, but obviously there are sensitive issues, and we have.
So Dan, do you believe that this would become an issue between Israel and the U.S. moving forward?
Look, I think that we have probably, and I've been talking both as private sector, but also I know at the level of government, Israel has definitely instituted a kind of CFIUS to try to, I would say, control, check foreign investment from all foreign entity in Israel, not only from China. And I think that we have a dialogue with the Americans. Sometimes we agree with them, sometimes we disagree with them. And this issue of China is certainly an issue that will, I would say, accompany us for many, many more years to come, because China is going to be a major power, but for sure, America is going to be a major ally for us, for sure. And therefore, Israel has to try to find the right positioning by working both with China and with the United States.
I see Israel is trying to strike a balance in here. But besides Israel, Einar, why do you think some Gulf countries are also striving to have deeper relations with Beijing? What is the reason for that? I mean, has Beijing proven to be more trustworthy than the traditional partners and neighbors?
Well, I guess we'll have it yet to be seen. I mean, obviously, there were some kerfuffles over Yemen, the Iron Dome, munitions, things like this. Both UAE and Saudi have refused to take calls from Biden. And, basically, there's a realignment. The U.S. doesn't need Middle East oil the way it used to. And as a result, and China does. So as a result, you're seeing a shift there. But Dan, to your point, on January 9th of this year, that's when the Israeli government made the statement that they would be clearing all deals with China. It was not negated by anybody, and it came from your government. So don't say that that's not true.
No, I'm sorry. I mean, I don't know what your sources are, but we are having Chinese delegation. We are negotiating a free trade agreement now between Israel and China.
It was reported in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal.
Okay, look, again, I mean, I have a lot of respect for journalists, but ICC is happening on the ground. We have still Chinese investment in Israel. We are maintaining relations between Israel and China, and the United States is perfectly aware of the sensitivity of those relations.
So
now, it's clear that China is now much more present in the Middle East, and Israel is now also more present in the Middle East with our neighbors. And definitely, the fact that the United States are retreating from this region, there is no vacuum, and the Chinese are filling in, and we see their presence in Arab countries, we see their presence in Israel, and we see their presence growing in the years to come.
So if we could move on, Dan, how Western sanctions against Russia, as you've just mentioned, prompted these countries to reconfigure their reserves and offset their exposure to the dollar and Western financial institutions. So the question is, what does this tell us about the future economic trends?
Well, look, there is no question that we are undergoing tremendous tectonic changes. Okay, the war in Ukraine and the sanction and the use of this economic tool, weaponizing, I would say, the sanction becoming a weapon of the West vis-a-vis Russia, etc., all that is definitely a major change that we don't see yet what is going to be the end of it. And also the de-dollarization of the international trade is not something that started now. It's something that has been existing for quite a long time already. The Chinese and the Russian, it's not now that they sign agreement on oil in ruble and yuan. They did it before the crisis that we are now facing. So this idea of de-dollarization and shift from the dollar, which is not necessarily only an American currency, it's international currency that is related to the United States. But we see definitely the euro that at one point wanted to take a stronger place in the international trade, and it has, maybe not as it wanted to, but definitely. So we are seeing changes. Yes. And we are not yet at the end of the process. So yes, the dollar is becoming less of a currency, but still very strong and still very dominant.
So is that why, Einar, is China on the one hand making these currency swaps with several countries while still holding hundreds of billions of dollars in the U.S. reserves?
You know, quite frankly, I mean, the U.S. and China are in the same boat on this one. I mean, they're both at the apex of the economic pyramid. They rely on the rest of the world to support it. And China is not, despite everything you read in the press, looking to destabilize anything. What they want is a world where they can trade with countries like Israel without any kind of ideological edge. Just simply, you have something, we have something, let's do something that benefits both of our sides.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.